Hey there, night wanderers. Tonight we're diving into something that'll probably make you question everything you think you know about the power of the sleeping mind. Prisoners who receive detailed escape plans in their dreams. And I'm talking about dreams so precise, so perfectly mapped out, that they work better than any prison architect's blueprint. So before you settle in for the night, take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe, but only if you genuinely find these strange historical tales as fascinating as I do. And I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight and what time it is for you. Drop it in the comments below. It's always wild to see our global community of insomniacs checking in from every corner of the world. Now get comfortable, maybe grab that favorite blanket, and prepare to explore some of the most ingenious prison breaks in history, breaks that were planned not in waking hours, but in the mysterious realm of dreams. And hey, if you've off somewhere in the middle, that's exactly what we're aiming for here. You know, I've always found it fascinating how desperation can unlock parts of our minds we never knew existed. Tonight, we're talking about people whose subconscious minds became their greatest allies when all hope seemed lost. Dreams don't just happen to you. Sometimes they happen for you, providing solutions your waking mind could never conceive. Anyway, let's start with what might be the most meticulously planned dream escape in medieval history. So picture this. It's 1578 in the Château d'If, that notorious island fortress off the coast of Marseille, and Francois Piquet has been rotting in a dungeon cell for 7 years. Not for any crime he actually committed, mind you, but because 3 jealous friends had framed him for being a British spy. Can you imagine? Your best buddies literally ruining your entire life out of pure jealousy. Francois had been a simple shoemaker at Enchiems before his world imploded. He wasn't wealthy, wasn't particularly ambitious, and certainly wasn't involved in any international espionage. His biggest crime was probably being engaged to Marguerite Vigoureux, the most beautiful woman in their small town. A woman that his 3 friends, Antoine Alout, Matthew Lupien, and Solari, had all been pursuing unsuccessfully for years. Picture the pettiness of it all. These guys couldn't handle losing to a shoemaker, so they decided to destroy him completely. They wrote anonymous letters to French authorities claiming Francois was passing military secrets to English agents. They forged documents, bribed witnesses, and created such a convincing case that Francois was arrested on his wedding day, literally as he was walking to the church. Marguerite watched her fiancé being dragged away in chains, having no idea that their mutual friends were responsible for orchestrating the whole nightmare. The Château d'If wasn't just any prison, it was where the French monarchy sent people they wanted to forget about forever. Built on a tiny island 3 miles from Marseille, it was essentially Alcatraz but with medieval torture thrown in for good measure. The cells were carved directly into rock, barely large enough for a grown man to lie down, with tiny windows that let in just enough light to remind prisoners that a world existed beyond their stone coffins. Francois had been imprisoned in cell 15, a particularly brutal space that was so damp the walls constantly wept moisture, creating a perpetual chill that seeped into your bones and never left. The cell measured roughly 6 feet by 8 feet, with a stone bench that served as both bed and table. His only companion was a steady population of rats that had grown bold from generations of imprisoned company. Now, Francois wasn't just sitting there feeling sorry for himself, though honestly, who could blame him if he had been? This guy was methodically going insane from isolation, spending his days staring at the same stone walls, listening to the same crashing waves, wondering if he'd ever see sunlight again. He would pace his cell for hours, all 4 steps of it, counting his footsteps until the numbers became meaningless. He talked to the rats, named them after people from his former life, and created elaborate conversations with imaginary visitors. The psychological torture of the Château d'If was almost worse than the physical conditions. The guards would deliberately withhold information about the outside world, letting prisoners' imaginations run wild about what was happening to their families, their businesses, their entire lives that were continuing without them. Francois spent months wondering if Marguerite had waited for him, if his shoemaking business had survived, if anyone even remembered he existed. But here's where it gets absolutely wild. One night in late 1578, after 7 years of this psychological and physical torment, Francois had a dream so vivid, so detailed, that he woke up thinking he'd actually lived through an escape. In the dream, he saw himself carefully loosening stones in his cell wall, not random stones, but specific ones that would create a passage to an adjacent cell that had been abandoned for decades. The dream wasn't just vague imagery, it was like watching a detailed instructional video. Francois could see exactly which stones to target, in what order to remove them, and even how to disguise the work during daily inspections. He saw himself using specific tools that could be improvised from his meager possessions, a spoon handle sharpened against stone, threads pulled from his clothing to measure distances, even techniques for mixing dirt and saliva to create mortar that would perfectly match the original wall construction. But here's the really bizarre part. In his dream, Francois could see things about the fortress layout that he'd never actually observed. He saw forgotten tunnels beneath the castle, ancient drainage systems that connected to the sea, and even the exact timing of guard rotations that he couldn't possibly have known from his isolated cell. It was like his sleeping mind had access to architectural plans that didn't exist anymore, or perhaps had never been officially documented. The dream showed him that cell 14, adjacent to his own, had been abandoned after a previous prisoner died of plague 15 years earlier. The guards had sealed it up and forgotten about it, but the dream revealed that the wall between the two cells was thinner than the outer fortress walls, thin enough that patient work could eventually break through. More importantly, cell 14 had a crucial feature that Francois' cell lacked: access to an old ventilation shaft that connected to the fortress's medieval drainage system. Francois' dream also revealed information that seemed impossible for him to know. He saw the fortress's original construction plans from the 1520s, including a network of tunnels and chambers that had been built for defensive purposes, but were no longer used or even remembered by current personnel. The dream showed him that these tunnels connected to a natural cave system in the island's bedrock, and that this cave system had underwater passages that led directly to the Mediterranean. When Francois woke up from this dream, he was so shaken by its realism that he actually started examining the stones the dream had shown him. And wouldn't you know it, those specific stones were indeed loose, just as he'd dreamed. The mortar around them was crumbling in exactly the pattern his subconscious had revealed. The dampness that made his cell so miserable had also been slowly deteriorating the wall's structural integrity, creating the exact weaknesses his dream had identified. I mean, what are the odds of that? A man dreams about specific architectural vulnerabilities in a medieval fortress, and those vulnerabilities turn out to be precisely accurate. It's like his unconscious mind had somehow conducted a detailed engineering survey while he was sleeping. So Francois started working, every night using makeshift tools he'd fashioned from his meager possessions. He would carefully chip away at the mortar around those stones. The work had to be absolutely silent. Any noise that might alert the guards would mean immediate transfer to an even worse cell, or more likely execution. He developed techniques for muffling the sound of his work, timing his activities to coincide with the crashing of waves against the fortress walls, which would mask any subtle noises his excavation might create. During the day, he'd cover his work with a mixture of dirt and saliva that perfectly matched the original mortar color, again, exactly as his dream had instructed. The technique was so sophisticated that even close inspection wouldn't reveal the tampering. Francois would sit on his stone bench, appearing to stare blankly at the wall like any other broken prisoner, while actually monitoring guard patrols and calculating optimal working windows for his nighttime excavations. The escape plan that unfolded over the next 3 months was like watching someone follow a detailed instruction manual that only existed in their dreams. Francois discovered that abandoned cell just as he'd seen. The space was exactly as his dream had shown it, a slightly larger cell with the remains of a previous prisoner's possessions still scattered around, including tools and materials that would prove invaluable for the next phase of his escape. But more importantly, cell 14 contained access to that ventilation shaft his dream had revealed. The shaft was hidden behind a loose stone panel that appeared to be part of the original wall construction. When Francois removed the panel, he found a narrow passage that descended through the fortress's foundations into the natural cave system below. He found the forgotten drainage tunnel, exactly as his sleeping mind had mapped it out. The tunnel was partially flooded, requiring Francois to navigate through waist-deep water in complete darkness, following a route that existed only in his memory of the dream. The passage was treacherous. One wrong turn could lead to a dead end where he would drown, trapped in an underwater maze beneath the fortress. He even encountered the same guards making their rounds at the exact times his dream had predicted. Francois had memorized not just their patrol routes, but their individual behavioral patterns, which guards were thorough in their inspections, which ones were lazy, and crucially, which guard had a drinking problem that made him predictable absent from his post at specific times each night. The night of his actual escape was almost anticlimactic because he'd already lived through it so many times in his sleep. He slipped through his handmade passage, navigated the flooded tunnels in complete darkness, and found himself standing on the rocky shore of the island, exactly where his dream had shown him a small boat would be waiting. And there it was, a small fishing boat that smugglers used for clandestine operations. Completely unaware they were about to become part of history's most dream-guided prison break. The boat appeared at the exact time and location his dream had predicted, operated by men who were following their own routine that had inadvertently intersected with Francois' impossible escape plan. But Francois didn't just escape, he completely disappeared for 14 years, during which time he methodically destroyed the lives of the 3 men who had framed him. He had transformed from a simple shoemaker into something else entirely, a patient, calculating force of retribution who understood that the best revenge is served cold enough to freeze your enemy's souls. Using skills and knowledge he'd somehow acquired during his imprisonment, Francois orchestrated their financial ruin through elaborate schemes that took years to unfold. He exposed their secrets, destroyed their reputations, and watched their families crumble, all while remaining completely invisible to them. When Alexandre Dumas heard this story decades later, it became the inspiration for The Count of Monte Cristo, though Dumas could never quite capture the psychological complexity of Francois' actual transformation. But what haunts me about Francois' story isn't just the escape. It's how his dream seemed to give him access to information he couldn't possibly have known. How did his sleeping mind map out fortress layouts he'd never seen? How did it predict guard schedules and smuggler activities with documentary precision? Makes you wonder what our brains are really capable of when we're desperate enough, when survival depends on accessing knowledge that exists somewhere beyond the boundaries of normal human perception. Speaking of dreams that defied all logical explanation, let me tell you about Brother Marcus and Brother Thomas, 2 Franciscan monks who were imprisoned in London's notorious Newgate prison in 1534 for refusing to acknowledge Henry VIII's break with Rome. Now, these weren't just any ordinary prisoners. They were highly educated men who had spent decades studying theology, philosophy, and what we'd now call psychology. Brother Marcus had been the head librarian at Greyfriars Monastery in Canterbury before Henry's dissolution of the monasteries began. This guy had read virtually every theological and philosophical text that existed in medieval Europe. We're talking about someone who could debate Aquinas in Latin, recite entire passages of Augustine from memory, and had spent 20 years copying manuscripts by hand in conditions that would make modern scholars weep with eye strain. His mind was like a medieval search engine, capable of cross-referencing thousands of theological arguments and philosophical principles at will. Brother Thomas was equally impressive, but in a completely different way. He'd been the monastery's infirmarian, essentially their doctor, psychologist, and counselor all rolled into one. Thomas had treated everything from plague symptoms to what we'd now recognize as severe depression and anxiety disorders. He understood the human mind in ways that wouldn't be formally recognized by medicine for another 400 years. This was a man who could diagnose mental illness by observing subtle changes in a person's posture and speech patterns. Together, these two represented the absolute pinnacle of medieval intellectual achievement. One focused on the life of the mind, the other on the complexities of human psychology and healing. They'd been arrested together while conducting a secret mass for Catholic families who refused to convert to Henry's new Anglican Church. Their crime wasn't violence or theft. It was insisting that religious authority came from Rome rather than from a king who wanted to remarry for the sixth time. Newgate Prison in the 16th century was basically a medieval horror show that made Francois Island Fortress look like a luxury resort. We're talking about overcrowded cells where 20 men might be chained together in a space designed for 5. No sanitation beyond buckets that were emptied maybe once a week, rampant disease that killed more prisoners than executions, and guards who were more like professional torturers than law enforcement. The building itself was a nightmare of medieval architecture designed specifically to break human spirits. Cells were carved directly into the ancient Roman walls that still formed part of London's defensive structure, creating spaces that were simultaneously claustrophobic and freezing cold. The walls wept moisture constantly, creating an atmosphere so damp that clothing never dried and everything smelled of mold, urine, and decay. The psychological conditions were even worse than the physical ones. Prisoners were deliberately kept in ignorance about their legal status, their trial dates, and even basic information about whether their families were alive or dead. The uncertainty was designed to drive men insane before they ever reached the executioner's block. Many prisoners confessed to crimes they hadn't committed simply to escape the psychological torture of not knowing what was going to happen to them. Brother Marcus and Thomas found themselves chained in cell 7, a particularly brutal space that housed 12 men in an area roughly 10 feet by 12 feet. The other prisoners included thieves, murderers, political dissidents, and several other clergy who had refused to acknowledge Henry's religious authority. The smell alone was enough to drive most people to madness. Unwashed bodies, human waste, infected wounds, and the sickly sweet odor of men slowly dying from disease. But here's where this story gets absolutely fascinating. Brother Marcus began having what he called shared dreams with Brother Thomas. They weren't just similar dreams, they were literally the same dreams, experienced simultaneously, featuring identical details that they would compare and confirm each morning. And these dreams were showing them something impossible, a way out of England's most secure prison. Now, you have to understand the context here. These weren't superstitious peasants prone to believing in magical phenomena. Marcus and Thomas were among the most educated men of their generation, trained in rigorous logical analysis and skeptical examination of extraordinary claims. They approached their shared dreams with the same intellectual scrutiny they would apply to any theological or philosophical problem. Marcus kept a secret journal, written in a cipher he developed during his years as a librarian, documenting every detail of their shared dream experiences. He recorded not just the content of the dreams, but also the specific timing, environmental conditions, and even their physical positions when the dreams occurred. This wasn't mystical speculation. It was scientific observation applied to paranormal phenomena. In their shared dreams, the monks saw themselves accessing a network of medieval tunnels that had been forgotten for over 2 centuries. These tunnels had originally been built by plague victims in the 1300s as escape routes, during times when entire city blocks were quarantined. The Black Death had killed roughly 1/3 of London's population, and survivors had created elaborate underground networks to move food, medicine, and people without risking exposure to infected areas. But here's what made their dreams so remarkably detailed. They weren't just seeing vague tunnel systems. The monks dreamed about specific measurements of passage widths, exact locations of structural supports, and even the precise depth of water that would accumulate in lower tunnels during different seasons. They saw architectural details that would require engineering expertise to understand, yet neither monk had any training in construction or underground navigation. The dreams showed them exact locations of tunnel entrances hidden behind false walls that had been constructed so skillfully they were invisible to casual observation. Thomas, with his medical background, realized that their dreams were providing information about air circulation patterns that would prevent suffocation during underground travel. The tunnel system included ingeniously designed ventilation shafts that drew fresh air from street level down into the underground passages. Marcus discovered that their shared dreams were revealing historical information that wasn't documented in any text he'd ever read. The plague tunnels had been built by survivors who deliberately avoided creating written records, understanding that knowledge of the tunnel's existence could be used against them by authorities. The location and design of these passages had been passed down through oral tradition among London's poorest residents, but that tradition had been broken when subsequent plague outbreaks killed many of the families who possessed the knowledge. Now, you have to understand, these monks had been born and raised in rural monasteries. They had no knowledge of London's underground geography, no access to historical architectural records, and certainly no way to research forgotten plague tunnels from their prison cells. Marcus had spent his entire adult life reading religious texts, not studying urban planning or medieval engineering. Thomas's medical knowledge was focused on treating individual patients, not understanding the public health infrastructure of medieval cities. Yet their dreams were providing them with information that would have required years of archival research and urban exploration to discover. They saw not just the tunnel locations, but also the political and social context that had created them. Their sleeping minds somehow accessed the collective memory of London's medieval residents, understanding how desperate people had created these passages and why they had been designed with specific features for specific purposes. The really eerie part, their dreams also showed them exactly when to attempt their escape. Not just any random night, but a specific date when a combination of factors would align perfectly. A new moon for maximum darkness. A shift change that would leave certain guard posts temporarily unmanned, and most crucially, a high tide that would flood the lower tunnels behind them, making pursuit impossible. The tidal calculations alone should have been impossible for medieval monks to understand. London's Thames has complex tidal patterns that vary seasonally and are influenced by weather conditions, lunar cycles, and the river's interaction with tributaries. Yet their dreams provided precise timing information that took into account all of these variables, calculating optimal conditions with accuracy that would challenge modern meteorologists. Brother Marcus later wrote in his secret journal that their shared dreams felt more real than their waking hours in the prison. He described experiencing the escape so many times in his sleep that when they actually attempted it, every movement felt like muscle memory. They knew exactly how many steps to take in complete darkness, precisely where to turn in tunnels they'd never seen, and even which stones would be loose enough to provide handholds during difficult climbs. The dreams also revealed something that seemed impossible, the exact locations of sympathetic prison guards who were secretly working with the Catholic underground. Medieval England had a complex network of religious dissidents who helped Catholic clergy escape persecution, but this network operated in absolute secrecy. Discovery meant execution for everyone involved, so contact protocols were incredibly sophisticated and constantly changing. Yet the monks' dreams provided them with specific information about which guards could be trusted, what code phrases would identify them as allies, and even personal details about the guards' motivations for risking their lives to help Catholic prisoners. They saw guards who had lost family members during Henry's religious persecution, men who secretly remained Catholic despite outward conversion, and even Protestant guards who disagreed with the brutality of religious imprisonment. For 3 months, the prisoners worked to implement the escape plan their collective unconscious had designed. During their limited interactions, meals, exercise periods, and brief moments in the corridors, they used the coded communication system from their dreams to coordinate preparations. Each monk had specific responsibilities, creating tools from available materials, gathering information about guard schedules, preparing disguises, and establishing timing sequences that would ensure their movements remained coordinated. Marcus used his intellectual skills to create detailed maps of the tunnel system based on their dream revelations, while Thomas applied his medical knowledge to calculate the physical demands of their underground journey. They prepared herbal remedies to prevent infection from cuts and scrapes, estimated caloric requirements for hours of physical exertion, and even developed breathing techniques that would maximize oxygen efficiency in potentially low-air environments. The most remarkable aspect of their shared dreaming was its adaptive quality. As conditions in the prison changed, new guards altered schedules, modified security procedures, their collective dreams would update the escape plan accordingly. It was as if their 5 sleeping minds were functioning as a single tactical computer, constantly processing new information and adjusting strategies in real time. When a new head guard was assigned to their section, their dreams immediately began providing information about his personal habits, his vulnerabilities, and the optimal approaches for avoiding his attention. When prison routines changed due to an outbreak of fever among the guards, their dreams recalculated timing sequences and alternative routes that would accommodate the new conditions. The night of their actual escape played out like a perfectly choreographed performance. They accessed the tunnel entrance exactly where their dreams had shown them, behind a false stone panel in the prison's foundation that had been installed during plague years, but forgotten by subsequent generations of guards and administrators. The tunnel entrance was hidden so cleverly that discovery required not just knowing its location, but also understanding the specific sequence of stone manipulations needed to open the passage. Their dreams had provided step-by-step instructions for accessing a medieval security system that was more sophisticated than most modern locks. They navigated the underground maze without hesitation, following routes that existed only in their shared memory of dreams they'd experienced dozens of times. The tunnels were exactly as they'd envisioned, narrow passages that required crawling in some sections, larger chambers with ancient stone carvings, and connecting passages that formed a complex network beneath medieval London. The most extraordinary part of their journey was how it connected to the living Catholic underground network that was operating in 16th century London. They emerged from a concealed exit near the Thames just as a boat appeared to ferry them across the river. The boat was operated by Catholic sympathizers who had been told in their own dreams to be at that exact location at that exact time. Brother Marcus and Thomas made it safely to France, where they lived out their lives in a monastery near Calais. But the strangest part of their story emerged decades later, when construction workers renovating Newgate Prison discovered the exact tunnel system the monks had described. Archaeological investigation revealed that these tunnels hadn't been accessed or documented for over 300 years, and there was no historical record of their existence in any archive the monks could have accessed. The shared dreaming phenomenon that guided their escape has never been adequately explained. How do 2 separate minds experience identical detailed visions of places and routes they've never seen? How did their sleeping consciousness access historical information that had been lost to waking knowledge for centuries? Sometimes I think the most profound mysteries aren't just about what the mind can know, but about how separate minds can somehow connect and share knowledge that transcends individual experience. Now here's a story that challenges everything we think we know about the boundaries between spiritual vision and practical planning. In 1876, during the brutal period following the Battle of Little Bighorn, a Lakota warrior named Tatanka Najin, Standing Buffalo, was captured by U.S. cavalry and imprisoned at Fort Laramie in Wyoming Territory. This wasn't just any prison, it was a military stockade designed specifically to hold Native American prisoners who were considered too dangerous for regular civilian facilities. Tatanka Najin wasn't just any ordinary warrior, he was what his people called a vision keeper, someone who had demonstrated an unusual ability to receive spiritual guidance through dreams and meditation since childhood. Among the Lakota, this wasn't considered supernatural or mystical. It was simply recognized as a natural human capability that some individuals possessed more strongly than others, like having exceptional eyesight or hearing. He'd grown up during the height of the Plains Wars, watching his people's way of life systematically destroyed by westward expansion. Military campaigns and government policies designed to force Native Americans onto reservations. Tatanka Najin had fought at Little Bighorn alongside Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull, and he'd seen firsthand how military tactics that seemed impossible to defeat could be overcome through spiritual guidance and tactical innovation. But now he found himself separated from his family during a forced relocation, facing the very real possibility of being shipped to a reservation hundreds of miles from his homeland, never to see his people again. Fort Laramie's Native American detention facility was essentially a death sentence disguised as imprisonment. Most prisoners died from disease. malnutrition, or violence long before their cases were officially processed. The fort itself was a monument to military efficiency designed to break indigenous resistance. Built on a strategic location along the Oregon Trail, it represented everything that was destroying Native American culture: permanent buildings that scarred the earth, walls that divided the natural world into artificial boundaries, and a rigid hierarchy that treated human beings as enemies to be conquered rather than people to be understood. Tatanka Najin's cell was barely large enough for him to lie down, with thick stone walls and a tiny window that provided just enough light to remind him that the world beyond existed but was no longer accessible to him. The psychological impact was deliberate. These cells were designed to destroy the spirit of men who had lived their entire lives under open skies, following buffalo herds across vast grasslands, and finding meaning through their connection to the natural world. But Tatanka Najin came from a tradition that viewed dreams not as random neural activity, but as communications from the spirit world, messages that could provide guidance, wisdom, and sometimes very practical solutions to seemingly impossible problems. Among his people, dream interpretation wasn't considered superstitious nonsense, but rather a sophisticated system for accessing knowledge that transcended individual human limitations. For 7 nights, Tatanka Najin engaged in what his people called a modified vision quest while imprisoned. He would fast during the day, drinking only small amounts of water, and spend his nights in deep meditation, calling on his ancestors and spirit guides to show him a path to freedom. This wasn't passive wishful thinking. It was an active spiritual practice that required intense mental discipline and physical endurance. The vision quest tradition among Plains tribes was incredibly sophisticated, involving specific techniques for altering consciousness, communicating with spiritual entities, and accessing information that wasn't available through normal sensory experience. Warriors would often spend days in isolation, fasting, and meditating until they received visions that provided guidance for hunting, warfare, or major life decisions. On the 7th night, Tatanka Najin experienced what he later described as the most vivid and comprehensive spiritual vision of his entire life. In this vision, he saw himself as an eagle soaring high above Fort Laramie, able to observe the entire military installation from a perspective impossible for any human prisoner. The eagle perspective wasn't just symbolic, it provided detailed, practical information about the fort's layout that he'd never seen from ground level. The vision showed him weak points in the perimeter fence where construction had been rushed or where weather had damaged the wooden barriers. He saw blind spots in the guard towers where sentries couldn't observe certain sections of the fort's interior. Most importantly, the vision revealed a seasonal creek that ran beneath the fort through a large drainage culvert, a feature that wasn't visible from inside the prison compound but was crucial for his escape plan. But here's where the vision gets absolutely remarkable. It didn't just show him the physical geography of his escape route. The vision also revealed the spiritual geography of the land around the fort. Tatanka Najin saw safe houses where sympathetic settlers would provide shelter, sacred sites where he could find food and water, and even the specific phases of moon and weather patterns that would provide optimal conditions for his journey home. The spiritual geography was as detailed as any modern GPS system. The vision showed him how to navigate using star constellations that were significant in Lakota cosmology, how to read animal signs that would indicate safe passages, and how to identify water sources by observing plant patterns and geological formations. This wasn't just mystical symbolism, it was practical survival knowledge encoded in spiritual terms. The vision revealed something that seemed impossible for a prisoner to know: the locations of sympathetic, white settlers who were secretly opposed to the military's treatment of Native Americans. These were farmers, traders, and even some military personnel who disagreed with government policy and were willing to provide assistance to escaped prisoners. The vision provided specific details about how to identify these allies and what protocols to follow when seeking their help. Tatanka Najin saw himself following particular star configurations that held spiritual significance for his people, but also served as accurate navigational guides. The vision showed him how to read specific animal signs, bird flight patterns, tracks, scat, that would indicate safe travel routes and warn him of military patrols. He learned to navigate by landmarks that held spiritual significance for the Lakota, but were invisible or meaningless to white settlers and soldiers. The vision was so detailed that it included what we might call a spiritual GPS system integrated with practical survival techniques. Tatanka Najin saw himself traveling in harmony with natural cycles, moving during specific weather patterns that would cover his tracks, resting at locations where water and food would be available, and timing his journey to coincide with seasonal animal migrations that would provide both sustenance and camouflage. When Tatanka Najin woke from this vision, he felt like he'd been given a sacred gift from his ancestors. But he also understood that visions without action were meaningless in Lakota tradition. Spiritual guidance was considered worthless unless it was applied to real-world challenges with courage, wisdom, and practical skill. Over the next several days, he carefully observed the fort during his limited time outside his cell, comparing what he saw with what the vision had revealed. Every detail matched perfectly. The drainage culvert was exactly where he'd seen it. The guard rotations followed the patterns shown in his vision. And even the timing of supply wagon deliveries aligned with what his spiritual guides had revealed. The precision was extraordinary. His vision had shown him that the evening guard change occurred at a specific time when there was a 12-minute window during which certain areas of the fort would be unobserved. He had seen that the drainage culvert could be accessed from a particular location where construction debris created a natural blind spot from the guard towers. Tatanka Najin also used his daytime observations to verify the spiritual aspects of his vision. He noticed that certain birds species that were significant in Lakota spiritual tradition appeared near the fort at specific times of day, following flight patterns that aligned with the navigational guidance his vision had provided. Even the weather patterns seemed to be developing exactly as his spiritual guides had predicted. The night of his escape, Tatanka Najin moved with the confidence of someone following a path he'd already traveled. He slipped out of the stockade during the exact time window his vision had specified, accessed the drainage culvert without hesitation, and began a journey across Wyoming territory that followed spiritual waypoints rather than geographical ones. His escape route took him through terrain that would have been impossible to navigate without extensive local knowledge or experienced guides. He traveled by night using star patterns his vision had revealed, and rested during the day in locations that provided both concealment and access to water and food. The spiritual guidance proved to be remarkably practical. Every safe house, water source, and rest stop appeared exactly where his vision had indicated. But here's the most extraordinary part of Tatanka Najin's story. His escape route took him through the territories of several different tribes, some of whom were traditionally enemies of the Lakota. Yet at each stop along his journey, he encountered tribal members who had also received dreams or visions, instructing them to provide assistance to a traveling warrior. These people had been spiritually prepared for his arrival, sometimes days in advance, through their own prophetic dreams. Cheyenne hunters gave him food and directions. Arapaho families provided shelter and fresh clothing. Even Crow warriors, traditional enemies of the Lakota, offered assistance because their own spiritual leaders had received visions instructing them to help a particular traveler, who would appear at a specific time and place. The network of spiritual communication that facilitated Tatanka Najin's escape seems to have operated across tribal boundaries, language barriers, and traditional political divisions. It was as if the entire indigenous community of the Northern Plains had received coordinated spiritual guidance to assist his journey home. Tatanka Najin traveled for 3 weeks, covering over 400 miles of hostile territory where military patrols were actively searching for escaped prisoners. He avoided capture by following routes that seemed to anticipate where soldiers would search, timing his movements to avoid patrol schedules he couldn't possibly have known about, and finding shelter in locations that provided perfect concealment from pursuing cavalry. The journey required not just physical endurance, but also sophisticated knowledge of survival techniques, weather patterns, animal behavior, and the political geography of different tribal territories. Yet Tatanka Najin navigated these challenges using guidance that had come entirely through spiritual vision rather than conventional education or training. When he finally reached his people, Tatanka Najin's escape became legendary among the Plains tribes, not just as a feat of individual determination, but as an example of how spiritual vision could provide practical guidance when conventional solutions seemed impossible. His story was told and retold around campfires, becoming part of the oral tradition that preserved indigenous knowledge and cultural values. What fascinates me about his story is how it demonstrates a completely different relationship between dreams and reality than what we typically recognize in Western culture. For Tatanka Najin, the vision wasn't separate from practical planning. It was the ultimate form of practical planning, providing information that transcended the limitations of ordinary human perception and connected him to a network of spiritual and practical support that spanned hundreds of miles of territory. The success of his escape suggests that indigenous spiritual traditions might have developed sophisticated techniques for accessing information and coordinating activities through means that modern science doesn't recognize or understand. It raises profound questions about the relationship between consciousness, spiritual experience, and practical problem solving that challenge our basic assumptions about how knowledge is acquired and shared. Here's one that'll make you question everything you think you know about the relationship between scientific reasoning and mystical revelation. In 1603, during the height of the Spanish Inquisition, a brilliant Jewish alchemist named Isaac ben Solomon was imprisoned in Toledo's infamous Inquisition dungeons. Isaac wasn't just any ordinary scholar, he was one of the most accomplished natural philosophers of his time, a man who had spent decades studying mathematics, astronomy, chemistry, and what we'd now call experimental psychology. Isaac had been born into a family of Conversos Jews, who had converted to Christianity to avoid persecution but secretly maintained their Jewish faith and traditions. His grandfather had been a renowned physician in Cordoba before the expulsion of 1492, and his father had managed to preserve much of the family's scientific library by hiding manuscripts in false walls and underground chambers throughout southern Spain. Growing up in this atmosphere of intellectual secrecy had shaped Isaac into someone who understood that knowledge itself could be dangerous. He'd learned to read Hebrew, Arabic, and Latin in hidden rooms, studying texts on astronomy, mathematics, and natural philosophy that the Inquisition considered heretical. By the time he reached adulthood, Isaac possessed one of the most comprehensive scientific educations in Europe, all acquired through clandestine study that could have resulted in his execution if discovered. Isaac's alchemical laboratory had been a marvel of Renaissance scientific achievement, hidden beneath his official profession as a metalworker and goldsmith. He'd spent 20 years conducting experiments that were centuries ahead of their time, studying chemical reactions, observing celestial movements, and developing mathematical models for predicting natural phenomena. His work represented the cutting edge of scientific knowledge, blending rigorous empirical observation with theoretical frameworks that wouldn't be formally recognized until the scientific revolution. But the Inquisition had arrested Isaac not just for practicing Judaism, though that certainly didn't help his case, but for his alchemical experiments, which church authorities considered dangerously close to witchcraft. The distinction between natural philosophy and sorcery was incredibly fine in early 17th century Spain, and anyone who demonstrated unusual knowledge of chemical processes or astronomical calculations risked being accused of consorting with diabolic forces. His laboratory had been destroyed with systematic thoroughness that was typical of Inquisition raids. Centuries of accumulated manuscripts were burned, rare instruments were smashed, and chemical apparatus that had taken years to construct was demolished in a matter of hours. The Inquisitors hadn't just wanted to stop Isaac's work, they wanted to erase any evidence that such sophisticated scientific investigation had ever existed in their jurisdiction. Isaac had been sentenced to life imprisonment in conditions designed to break both his body and his mind. The Inquisition dungeons in Toledo were specifically engineered to destroy intellectual prisoners, scholars, writers, and natural philosophers who represented threats to religious orthodoxy. We're talking about stone cells barely large enough to lie down in, with no light except what filtered through a tiny window near the ceiling, and no human contact except for the daily delivery of bread and water. But Isaac's scientific mind didn't shut down just because he was imprisoned. If anything, the isolation seemed to intensify his mental capabilities. He began treating his imprisonment as the ultimate experimental challenge. How do you escape from a theoretically escape-proof environment, using only the power of systematic observation and logical reasoning? This wasn't just idle speculation to pass time. Isaac approached his predicament with the same methodical rigor he'd applied to his alchemical research. He understood that escape would require gathering information, formulating hypotheses, testing theories, and implementing solutions based on empirical evidence rather than wishful thinking. For months, Isaac spent his waking hours making detailed observations of everything he could perceive from his cell. He memorized guard schedules by listening to footsteps and counting the intervals between patrols. He calculated the timing of meal deliveries by tracking shadows on his cell wall throughout the day. He analyzed the acoustic properties of the prison corridors by listening to how sounds traveled through stone passages, using mathematical principles to estimate distances and architectural configurations. Isaac even developed techniques for measuring his cell's dimensions using his own body as a reference standard, then applying geometric principles to calculate the thickness of walls based on sound transmission patterns. He observed how temperature and humidity varied throughout the day, using this data to infer information about the prison's orientation, the thickness of exterior walls, and the presence of underground chambers or passages. But all of this conscious analysis wasn't yielding a viable escape plan. The prison was simply too well designed and too heavily guarded. Every logical approach Isaac could devise led to the same conclusion. Escape was mathematically impossible given the constraints he could observe. His rational mind had reached its limits, unable to identify any sequence of actions that would result in freedom. Then Isaac had what he later described as the most mathematically precise dream of his entire life. In this dream, he found himself standing in his cell, but with the ability to see through walls using what seemed like X-ray vision. The dream showed him the complete architectural blueprint of the prison, not just his section, but the entire complex, including structural details that were hidden from normal observation. What made this dream particularly remarkable was its scientific accuracy. Isaac's sleeping mind somehow calculated precise measurements, structural stress points, and engineering vulnerabilities that his conscious mind couldn't have determined. The dream revealed that the prison had been built on the foundation of an ancient Roman villa, and that certain sections of the floor were supported by hollow spaces that connected to a forgotten Roman-era sewer system. The level of architectural detail in Isaac's dream was extraordinary. He saw load-bearing walls versus decorative partitions, identified which sections of flooring were solid stone versus hollow construction, and even calculated the structural engineering principles that determined how weight was distributed throughout the building. This wasn't vague, mystical imagery. It was precise technical information that would require professional architectural training to understand. The dream showed him that Toledo's Roman foundations included a sophisticated underground infrastructure that predated the current prison by over 1,000 years. Ancient Roman engineers had built extensive sewer systems, water channels, and underground passages that connected different parts of the city. Most of these underground networks had been forgotten after the fall of the Roman Empire, but they still existed beneath medieval and Renaissance construction. But here's where Isaac's scientific training became crucial. He didn't just accept the dream as mystical revelation. Instead, he treated it as a hypothesis that needed to be tested through systematic observation and experimentation. The dream had provided him with specific claims about architectural features that could be verified through careful investigation. During his limited time outside his cell for meals and exercise, Isaac began conducting subtle experiments to verify the information his dream had provided. He would drop small objects in specific locations and listen carefully to the sounds they made when hitting the floor. The acoustic properties of solid stone versus hollow spaces were distinctly different, and Isaac used mathematical principles to analyze the reverberations and calculate the presence of void spaces beneath the stones. He tested the structural integrity of walls by applying pressure at precise points his dream had identified as weak spots. Using his knowledge of physics and engineering, Isaac could determine which sections of masonry were structurally sound versus which areas showed signs of stress, settling, or deterioration. Every test confirmed the accuracy of his dream-provided architectural analysis. Isaac also used his understanding of chemistry to analyze the composition of different building materials in his cell. By observing how stones responded to moisture, temperature changes, and physical stress, he could distinguish between Roman-era construction and later medieval additions. The dream had shown him exactly which stones were original Roman work versus later Inquisition modifications. The escape plan that emerged from Isaac's dream was like something from a modern engineering textbook. His sleeping mind had calculated the exact sequence of stones that needed to be removed to access the ancient sewer system, the precise tools that could be improvised from available materials, and even the optimal timing based on seasonal water levels in the underground passages. The engineering calculations were incredibly sophisticated. Isaac's dream had provided him with information about structural load distribution, showing him how to remove stones in a specific sequence that wouldn't cause a collapse while creating an opening large enough for human passage. The plan included backup procedures for dealing with unexpected complications and alternative routes if his primary escape passage proved unusable. Isaac spent 6 months executing his scientifically guided escape plan, working only at night, using tools he'd crafted from metal fragments and bone fragments from his meals. He methodically removed the specific floor stones his dream had identified. The work required extraordinary precision. He couldn't afford to make any mistakes that might alert the guards or cause a structural collapse that would trap him permanently. The tools Isaac created were marvels of improvised engineering. He sharpened metal fragments by grinding them against stone surfaces, using geometric principles to create cutting edges with optimal angles for different types of work. He fashioned measuring devices from threads pulled from his clothing, allowing him to maintain precise dimensions throughout his excavation. He even developed techniques for disposing of debris without creating evidence that would reveal his activities to guards. Each night's work was planned with mathematical precision. Isaac calculated exactly how much stone material he could remove without creating structural instability, how to distribute the debris to avoid detection, and how to camouflage his progress during daylight hours when guards might inspect his cell. The entire project was executed with the systematic methodology of a scientific experiment. When Isaac finally broke through to the ancient sewer system, everything was exactly as his dream had shown him. The passages led directly to the Tagus River, following routes that had been designed by Roman engineers over a millennium earlier. The underground network was far more extensive than anything Isaac had imagined possible, with multiple branches that connected different parts of the city through a sophisticated hydraulic system. The sewer passages required navigation skills that Isaac had somehow acquired through his dream revelations. He understood which routes were safe versus which passages were prone to flooding, how to identify fresh air sources that would prevent suffocation, and even how to move through the tunnels without creating noise that might alert authorities above ground. Isaac escaped on a moonless night, following the river downstream to a location where Jewish merchants were waiting with a boat. Merchants who had been contacted through a network of coded messages that Isaac had somehow embedded in his prison meal requests. The communication system he'd developed was incredibly sophisticated, using variations in how he arranged food scraps to send complex messages to collaborators he'd never met directly. Isaac made it safely to Amsterdam, where he lived under an assumed name and continued his scientific work until his death 30 years later. But he never stopped trying to understand the mechanism behind his prophetic dream. In his private journals, discovered centuries later in a hidden compartment of his Amsterdam laboratory, Isaac theorized that extreme stress and sensory deprivation might unlock computational abilities of the human brain that are normally inaccessible to conscious thought. His escape became a legend among imprisoned scholars throughout Europe, not just as an example of individual genius, but as proof that scientific reasoning and mystical experience might not be as separate as we typically assume. Isaac's story suggests that under extreme circumstances, the human mind might be capable of accessing information and performing calculations through mechanisms that our current, understanding of consciousness cannot explain? Here's one that'll make you question everything you think you know about the relationship between scientific reasoning and mystical revelation. In 1603, during the height of the Spanish Inquisition, a brilliant Jewish alchemist named Isaac ben Solomon was imprisoned in Toledo's infamous Inquisition dungeons. Isaac wasn't just any ordinary scholar, he was one of the most accomplished natural philosophers of his time, a man who had spent decades studying mathematics, astronomy, chemistry, and what we'd now call experimental psychology. Isaac had been born into a family of conversos Jews, who had converted to Christianity to avoid persecution but secretly maintained their Jewish faith and traditions. His grandfather had been a renowned physician in Cordoba before the expulsion of 1492, and his father had managed to preserve much of the family's scientific library by hiding manuscripts in false walls and underground chambers throughout southern Spain. Growing up in this atmosphere of intellectual secrecy had shaped Isaac into someone who understood that knowledge itself could be dangerous. He'd learned to read Hebrew, Arabic, and Latin in hidden rooms, studying texts on astronomy, mathematics, and natural philosophy that the Inquisition considered heretical. By the time he reached adulthood, Isaac possessed one of the most comprehensive scientific educations in Europe, all acquired through clandestine study that could have resulted in his execution if discovered. Isaac's alchemical laboratory had been a marvel of Renaissance scientific achievement, hidden beneath his official profession as a metalworker and goldsmith. He'd spent 20 years conducting experiments that were centuries ahead of their time, studying chemical reactions, observing celestial movements, and developing mathematical models for predicting natural phenomena. His work represented the cutting edge of scientific knowledge, blending rigorous, empirical observation with theoretical frameworks that wouldn't be formally recognized until the scientific revolution. But the Inquisition had arrested Isaac not just for practicing Judaism, though that certainly didn't help his case, but for his alchemical experiments, which church authorities considered dangerously close to witchcraft. The distinction between natural philosophy and sorcery was incredibly fine in early 17th century Spain, and anyone who demonstrated unusual knowledge of chemical processes or astronomical calculations risked being accused of consorting with diabolic forces. His laboratory had been destroyed with systematic thoroughness that was typical of Inquisition raids. Centuries of accumulated manuscripts were burned, rare instruments were smashed, and chemical apparatus that had taken years to construct was demolished in a matter of hours. The Inquisitors hadn't just wanted to stop Isaac's work, they wanted to erase any evidence that such sophisticated scientific investigation had ever existed in their jurisdiction. Isaac had been sentenced to life imprisonment in conditions designed to break both his body and his mind. The Inquisition dungeons in Toledo were specifically engineered to destroy intellectual prisoners, scholars, writers, and natural philosophers who represented threats to religious orthodoxy. We're talking about stone cells barely large enough to lie down in, with no light except what filtered through a tiny window near the ceiling, and no human contact except for the daily delivery of bread and water. But Isaac's scientific mind didn't shut down just because he was imprisoned. If anything, the isolation seemed to intensify his mental capabilities. He began treating his imprisonment as the ultimate experimental challenge. How do you escape from a theoretically escape-proof environment, using only the power of systematic observation and logical reasoning? This wasn't just idle speculation to pass time. Isaac approached his predicament with the same methodical rigor he'd applied to his alchemical research. He understood that escape would require gathering information, formulating hypotheses, testing theories, and implementing solutions based on empirical evidence rather than wishful thinking. For months, Isaac spent his waking hours making detailed observations of everything he could perceive from his cell. He memorized guard schedules by listening to footsteps and counting the intervals between patrols. He calculated the timing of meal deliveries by tracking shadows on his cell wall throughout the day. He analyzed the acoustic properties of the prison corridors by listening to how sounds traveled through stone passages, using mathematical principles to estimate distances and architectural configurations. Isaac even developed techniques for measuring his cell's dimensions using his own body as a reference standard. then applying geometric principles to calculate the thickness of walls based on sound transmission patterns. He observed how temperature and humidity varied throughout the day, using this data to infer information about the prison's orientation, the thickness of exterior walls, and the presence of underground chambers or passages. But all of this conscious analysis wasn't yielding a viable escape plan. The prison was simply too well designed and too heavily guarded. Every logical approach Isaac could devise led to the same conclusion. Escape was mathematically impossible given the constraints he could observe. His rational mind had reached its limits, unable to identify any sequence of actions that would result in freedom. Then Isaac had what he later described as the most mathematically precise dream of his entire life. In this dream, he found himself standing in his cell, but with the ability to see through walls using what seemed like X-ray vision. The dream showed him the complete architectural blueprint of the prison, not just his section, but the entire complex, including structural details that were hidden from normal observation. What made this dream particularly remarkable was its scientific accuracy. Isaac's sleeping mind somehow calculated precise measurements, structural stress points, and engineering vulnerabilities that his conscious mind couldn't have determined. The dream revealed that the prison had been built on the foundation of an ancient Roman villa, and that certain sections of the floor were supported by hollow spaces that connected to a forgotten Roman-era sewer system. The level of architectural detail in Isaac's dream was extraordinary. He saw load-bearing walls versus decorative partitions, identified which sections of flooring were solid stone versus hollow construction, and even calculated the structural engineering principles that determined how weight was distributed throughout the building. This wasn't vague mystical imagery, it was precise technical information that would require professional architectural training to understand. The dream showed him that Toledo's Roman foundations included a sophisticated underground infrastructure that predated the current prison by over 1,000 years. Ancient Roman engineers had built extensive sewer systems, water channels, and underground passages that connected different parts of the city. Most of these underground networks had been forgotten after the fall of the Roman Empire, but they still existed beneath medieval and Renaissance construction. But here's where Isaac's scientific training became crucial. He didn't just accept the dream as mystical revelation. Instead, he treated it as a hypothesis that needed to be tested through systematic observation and experimentation. The dream had provided him with specific claims about architectural features that could be verified through careful investigation. During his limited time outside his cell for meals and exercise, Isaac began conducting subtle experiments to verify the information his dream had provided. He would drop small objects in specific locations and listen carefully to the sounds they made when hitting the floor. The acoustic properties of solid stone versus hollow spaces were distinctly different, and Isaac used mathematical principles to analyze the reverberations and calculate the presence of void spaces beneath the stones. He tested the structural integrity of walls by applying pressure at precise points his dream had identified as weak spots. Using his knowledge of physics and engineering, Isaac could determine which sections of masonry were structurally sound versus which areas showed signs of stress, settling, or deterioration. Every test confirmed the accuracy of his dream-provided architectural analysis. Isaac also used his understanding of chemistry to analyze the composition of different building materials in his cell. By observing how stones responded to moisture, temperature changes, and physical stress, he could distinguish between Roman-era construction and later medieval additions. The dream had shown him exactly which stones were original Roman work versus later Inquisition modifications. The escape plan that emerged from Isaac's dream was like something from a modern engineering textbook. His sleeping mind had calculated the exact sequence of stones that needed to be removed to access the ancient sewer system, the precise tools that could be improvised from available materials, and even the optimal timing based on seasonal water levels in the underground passages. The engineering calculations were incredibly sophisticated. Isaac's dream had provided him with information about structural load distribution, showing him how to remove stones in a specific sequence that wouldn't cause a collapse while creating an opening large enough for human passage. The plan included backup procedures for dealing with unexpected complications and alternative routes if his primary escape passage proved unusable. Isaac spent 6 months executing his scientifically guided escape plan, working only at night, using tools he'd crafted from metal fragments and bone fragments from his meals. He methodically removed the specific floor stones his dream had identified. The work required extraordinary precision. He couldn't afford to make any mistakes that might alert the guards or cause a structural collapse that would trap him permanently. The tools Isaac created were marvels of improvised engineering. He sharpened metal fragments by grinding them against stone surfaces, using geometric principles to create cutting edges with optimal angles for different types of work. He fashioned measuring devices from threads pulled from his clothing, allowing him to maintain precise dimensions throughout his excavation. He even developed techniques for disposing of debris without creating evidence that would reveal his activities to guards. Each night's work was planned with mathematical precision. Isaac calculated exactly how much stone material he could remove without creating structural instability, how to distribute the debris to avoid detection, and how to camouflage his progress during daylight hours when guards might inspect his cell. The entire project was executed with the systematic methodology of a scientific experiment. When Isaac finally broke through to the ancient sewer system, everything was exactly as his dream had shown him. The passages led directly to the Tagus River, following routes that had been designed by Roman engineers over a millennium earlier. The underground network was far more extensive than anything Isaac had imagined possible, with multiple branches that connected different parts of the city through a sophisticated hydraulic system. The sewer passages required navigation skills that Isaac had somehow acquired through his dream revelations. He understood which routes were safe versus which passages were prone to flooding, how to identify fresh air sources that would prevent suffocation, and even how to move through the tunnels without creating noise that might alert authorities above ground. Isaac escaped on a moonless night, following the river downstream to a location where Jewish merchants were waiting with a boat. Merchants, who had been contacted through a network of coded messages that Isaac had somehow embedded in his prison meal requests. The communication system he'd developed was incredibly sophisticated, using variations in how he arranged food scraps to send complex messages to collaborators he'd never met directly. Isaac made it safely to Amsterdam, where he lived under an assumed name and continued his scientific work until his death 30 years later. But he never stopped trying to understand the mechanism behind his prophetic dream. In his private journals, discovered centuries later in a hidden compartment of his Amsterdam laboratory, Isaac theorized that extreme stress and sensory deprivation might unlock computational abilities of the human brain that are normally inaccessible to conscious thought. His escape became a legend among imprisoned scholars throughout Europe, not just as an example of individual genius, but as proof that scientific reasoning and mystical experience might not be as separate as we typically assume. Isaac's story suggests that under extreme circumstances, the human mind might be capable of accessing information and performing calculations through mechanisms that our current understanding of consciousness cannot explain. Let me tell you about something that happened along the ancient Silk Road that's going to make you rethink everything you know about navigation and dreams. In 1274, a Venetian silk merchant named Giovanni Benedetto was imprisoned by Mongol raiders while traveling through what's now modern-day Kazakhstan. Giovanni wasn't just any trader. He was one of those remarkable medieval travelers who could speak 7 languages, navigate by the stars, and had spent 15 years building trading relationships across Central Asia. Giovanni came from a family of merchants who had been trading with the East for 3 generations. His grandfather had been among the first Venetians to establish permanent trading posts in Constantinople after the Fourth Crusade, and his father had extended the family's commercial network all the way to the Crimean ports, where Eastern and Western goods changed hands like pieces in an elaborate chess game. But Giovanni was more ambitious than his predecessors. He'd spent years learning Mongolian, Persian, and even rudimentary Chinese, understanding that successful trade in Central Asia required more than just good merchandise. It demanded cultural fluency and the ability to navigate complex political relationships between different nomadic groups, settled communities, and emerging merchant kingdoms. The Mongols who captured Giovanni weren't interested in killing him. He was too valuable alive. His wagon train had been loaded with Flemish wool, Venetian glass, and Byzantine silk that would fetch enormous profits in Chinese markets. More importantly, Giovanni himself represented a walking encyclopedia of European trade routes, commercial contacts, and the political relationships that made long-distance commerce possible. They imprisoned him in a felt-lined yurt that was essentially a mobile prison, planning to sell him as a high-value slave to Chinese officials who could exploit his knowledge of European trade routes. But Giovanni had been captured during winter, and the Mongol camp was snowed in for 3 months in the middle of the steppes, giving him time to plan something extraordinary. The psychological impact of his captivity was profound. Giovanni had spent his entire adult life in motion, traveling thousands of miles each year, constantly negotiating with new people and adapting to different cultures. Being confined to a single yurt, even a relatively spacious one, was like psychological torture for someone whose identity was built around movement and freedom. During those long winter nights when temperatures dropped so low that even the Mongols huddled around fires and told stories to pass the time, Giovanni began having dreams that showed him detailed star maps of the night sky above the Mongol territories. But these weren't just any astronomical visions. They were precise navigational charts that revealed seasonal star patterns, optimal travel routes, and even the locations of hidden water sources across hundreds of miles of seemingly barren landscape. Here's what makes Giovanni's dreams absolutely fascinating from a historical perspective. Medieval European navigation was primarily based on Mediterranean and Atlantic star patterns. Venetian merchants were experts at navigating the relatively calm waters of the Mediterranean, the familiar coastlines of Europe, and the well-established trade routes that connected Italian city-states with Byzantine and Islamic commercial centers. But Central Asian astronomy was a completely different science. The steppes required navigation techniques based on different constellations, seasonal variations that didn't occur in Mediterranean climates, and methods for finding direction and distance across vast grasslands where there were no landmarks, no coastlines, and no familiar reference points. Giovanni had no formal training in Central Asian astronomy, no access to Chinese or Persian star charts, and certainly no way to study the specific celestial navigation techniques used by nomadic peoples of the steppes. Yet his dreams were providing him with information that would have required years of study with experienced Mongol or Chinese astronomers to acquire. The dreams showed him constellation patterns that were only visible from specific latitudes, taught him to identify stars that served as navigational markers for desert and steppe travel, and even revealed seasonal changes in star positions that would allow him to calculate optimal timing for long-distance travel across the Silk Road. The level of astronomical detail was extraordinary. He learned to recognize not just major constellations, but also individual stars whose positions could indicate direction, time of night, and seasonal cycles. But Giovanni's dreams went beyond just astronomical knowledge. They also revealed detailed information about the human geography of Central Asia. He saw trading posts, monastery refuges, and nomadic camp locations along potential escape routes. His sleeping mind somehow mapped out a network of safe houses and friendly contacts that stretched across thousands of miles of some of the most dangerous territory in the medieval world. The dreams revealed the locations of Buddhist monasteries, where monks would provide shelter to travelers regardless of their religious background, Nestorian Christian communities that maintained informal networks for assisting merchants and pilgrims, and even Islamic trading posts where Venetian commercial connections might provide assistance to an escaped prisoner. Giovanni saw specific seasonal patterns of nomadic movement, which tribes would be in particular locations during different times of year, how pastoral communities followed grazing patterns across the steppes, and where temporary settlements would appear during seasonal migrations. This information was crucial for survival, since approaching the wrong group at the wrong time could mean immediate death or recapture. The escape plan that emerged from Giovanni's dreams was incredibly sophisticated. He would need to time his departure to coincide with specific weather patterns that would cover his tracks, navigate using star patterns that his dreams had taught him to recognize, and follow a route that connected various sources of food, water, and shelter across the steppes. Giovanni spent weeks preparing for his escape while appearing to be a docile prisoner. He secretly crafted tools from materials in his yurt, sharpening metal fragments to create cutting implements, weaving rope from felt fibers and fashioning containers that could hold water and food for extended travel. He memorized the astronomical calculations from his dreams, practicing star recognition during his limited time outside the yurt. He also studied his Mongol captors, learning their language patterns, understanding their daily routines, and identifying opportunities for escape. Giovanni realized that his best chance would come during the spring migration, when the camp would be in motion and guards would be focused on managing livestock and navigating across unfamiliar terrain. The dreams had shown Giovanni that his escape would need to occur during a specific weather window, a late spring snowstorm that would provide cover for his departure, while creating conditions that would make pursuit difficult for mounted cavalry. The timing had to be perfect, since too early would mean traveling through severe weather that could kill him, while too late would mean missing the seasonal opportunities for finding water and shelter along his route. When spring arrived and the Mongol camp began preparing to move, Giovanni put his dream-guided plan into action. His escape was like watching someone navigate with a GPS system that existed only in their unconscious mind. He traveled at night using the star patterns his dreams had taught him, found water and shelter at locations his visions had revealed, and even encountered friendly traders and monks who provided assistance exactly where his dreams had predicted. The journey required extraordinary physical endurance and psychological resilience. Giovanni traveled over 800 miles across Central Asian steppes and mountains, through territory where a single navigation mistake could mean death from exposure, dehydration, or attack by hostile nomadic groups. Yet he maintained his direction and timing with accuracy that would challenge modern GPS navigation systems. The most remarkable aspect of Giovanni's journey was its cultural accuracy. When he encountered different ethnic groups along his route, he was able to use specific greeting rituals, gift-giving protocols, and cultural knowledge that his dreams had somehow provided. These interactions were so authentic that several tribal leaders assumed he had extensive prior experience with steppe peoples, when in fact he had never traveled beyond the Black Sea before his capture. Giovanni arrived at the Mediterranean trading post of Trebizond exactly where his dreams had indicated he would reach safety. The entire journey took 4 months and crossed territories that would have been impossible to navigate without extensive local knowledge or expert guides. When he finally made it back to Venice, he brought with him detailed maps and astronomical charts based on his dream revelations. These charts proved to be so accurate that they were used by Venetian traders for decades, opening up new trade routes and establishing commercial relationships across Central Asia that hadn't existed before. Giovanni's escape became legendary among medieval travelers, not just as an example of individual determination, but as proof that the human mind might be capable of accessing navigational knowledge through means that transcended normal learning and experience. Here's a story from the 14th century that's going to sound like something from a modern thriller, but it actually happened during the worst plague outbreak in European history, Dr. Benedict. Zimmermann was a German physician who had been imprisoned by local authorities in Cologne for refusing to abandon plague victims during the Black Death pandemic of 1348. The city officials wanted all medical personnel to focus exclusively on treating wealthy citizens who could pay for their services, but Benedict insisted on providing care to poor families who were dying in the streets. Benedict had trained at the University of Montpellier, one of Europe's most advanced medical schools, where he'd studied not just traditional Galenic medicine, but also Islamic medical texts that had been translated from Arabic. He understood disease transmission, anatomical structure, and pharmaceutical preparations with sophistication that was centuries ahead of most European physicians. More importantly, he developed a personal medical philosophy that viewed healing as a moral obligation rather than just a profitable profession. When the Black Death reached Cologne in 1347, Benedict had voluntarily established a treatment center in the city's poorest quarter, where he provided free medical care to families who couldn't afford the services of established physicians. He converted an abandoned warehouse into a makeshift hospital, training local women in basic nursing techniques and creating one of the first systematic approaches to plague treatment in medieval Europe. His methods were revolutionary for the time. Instead of following traditional approaches that relied on bloodletting and purging, Benedict focused on symptom management, pain relief, and creating sanitary conditions that would prevent secondary infections. He developed herbal remedies based on Islamic medical texts, nutritional protocols that helped patients maintain strength during the disease's progression, and isolation procedures that reduced transmission rates in his treatment facility. But the city authorities viewed Benedict's work as a threat to the established medical hierarchy. Licensed physicians complained that his free treatment was undermining their ability to charge premium rates during the pandemic. City officials worried that his treatment center was attracting diseased poor people from surrounding areas, potentially worsening the outbreak within Cologne's walls. Medieval imprisonment during plague years was essentially a death sentence. Prisons were overcrowded, unsanitary, and full of disease. The authorities understood that imprisoning a physician during a pandemic was effectively murdering him, but they prioritized economic and social control over public health. Benedict realized that he would probably die within weeks if he remained in custody, but he also knew that hundreds of poor families were suffering without medical care while he was locked away. The ethical dilemma was tearing him apart. How do you escape from prison to save lives when escaping itself is almost impossible? Benedict had always been a man of principle who believed that medical knowledge carried moral responsibilities, but he'd never imagined that following his conscience would require breaking the law and risking execution as an escaped prisoner. For 7 nights, Benedict had the same recurring dream that showed him navigating through Cologne's underground sewer and tunnel systems to reach plague victims who were hiding in cellars and abandoned buildings throughout the city. But these dreams weren't just showing him escape routes, they were revealing a comprehensive map of underground passages that connected to a network of safe houses where he could provide medical treatment without being recaptured. The dreams revealed that Cologne's Roman-era infrastructure included extensive underground networks that had been forgotten by medieval inhabitants, but were still structurally sound and navigable. Ancient Roman engineers had built sophisticated sewer systems, drainage tunnels, and underground passages that connected different parts of the city through a complex hydraulic network that continued to function centuries after the empire's collapse. What made Benedict's dreams particularly remarkable was their medical accuracy. His sleeping mind was somehow calculating plague transmission patterns, identifying which neighborhoods would be safest for underground medical work, and even revealing the locations of hidden medical supplies that had been cached by other physicians before their own deaths or imprisonment. The dreams also showed Benedict something that seemed impossible, an underground network of plague survivors who were secretly caring for orphan children and abandoned families. These people had been organizing themselves into what was essentially a medieval underground railroad, using tunnel systems and hidden passages to move supplies, provide medical care, and evacuate the most vulnerable plague victims to safer areas outside the city. This network had been established by other medical professionals, clergy members, and ordinary citizens who had refused to abandon their humanitarian responsibilities despite official orders to the contrary. They had been secretly coordinating their efforts through coded messages, hidden supply caches, and a communication system that used the city's tunnel networks to move information without detection. The level of organizational sophistication revealed in Benedict's dreams was extraordinary. He saw supply distribution networks that ensured medical materials reached different treatment locations, communication protocols that allowed coordination between separate medical teams, and evacuation procedures that could move vulnerable patients to safety without exposing them to official persecution. When Benedict finally attempted his escape, everything unfolded exactly as his dreams had predicted. He accessed the prison's connection to Cologne's ancient Roman sewer system, navigated underground passages that led directly to the first safe house on his mental map, and immediately encountered members of the medical underground who had been expecting his arrival. The underground medical network was more extensive and sophisticated than anything Benedict had imagined possible. Physicians, nurses, clergy members, and ordinary citizens had created a parallel healthcare system that operated entirely in secret, providing treatment to plague victims who had been abandoned by official authorities. The network included hidden hospitals, secret supply channels, and communication methods that allowed coordination across the entire city. For the next 6 months, Benedict operated as part of this secret network, providing medical care to plague victims while moving through underground tunnels to avoid capture. His dreams continued to provide him with information about safe routes, hidden supplies, and even the timing of official raids that might threaten their operations. The guidance seemed to adapt to changing conditions, providing updated information about patrol schedules, new safe houses, and emerging opportunities for medical intervention. The most extraordinary aspect of Benedict's story was how his medical work seemed to be guided by the same mysterious knowledge source that had provided his escape plan. His dreams began revealing specific treatment methods, herbal remedies, and prevention techniques that proved remarkably effective against plague symptoms. Some of these treatments weren't officially recognized by medieval medicine, but showed results that saved hundreds of lives. Dr. Benedict Zimmermann never returned to official medical practice, but his secret plague treatment network saved an estimated 2,000 lives during the worst years of the Black Death in Cologne. His detailed journals, hidden in monastery walls and discovered centuries later, provide one of the most comprehensive accounts of grassroots medical resistance during the plague years, demonstrating how human compassion and professional dedication could transcend official authority even during history's darkest periods. This one's going to transport you to the brutal landscape of the Third Crusade, where survival often depended on information that seemed to come from beyond normal human knowledge. In 1191, Sir William de Montfort, an English knight, was captured by Saladin's forces near Jerusalem and imprisoned in a fortress carved into the desert cliffs near the Dead Sea. William wasn't just any ordinary crusader, he was a highly experienced military engineer who had spent years studying siege warfare, desert survival, and Middle Eastern geography. William came from the noble Montfort family, but unlike many of his peers who viewed the Crusades as a religious adventure, he approached warfare as a science. He'd spent months before his capture studying Islamic military architecture, learning rudimentary Arabic to better understand enemy tactics, and developing innovative approaches to siege warfare that combined European engineering with Middle Eastern techniques. His reputation as a strategic thinker had made him valuable to Crusader commanders, but it also made him a high-priority target for capture. The fortress where William was imprisoned was considered absolutely escape-proof, carved directly into solid rock, hundreds of feet above the desert floor, with only one heavily guarded entrance and no apparent alternative routes in or out. The location had been chosen specifically for its isolation and the impossibility of rescue. Even if someone managed to escape the fortress itself, the surrounding desert was so hostile that survival seemed impossible without extensive local knowledge, proper supplies, and navigation skills that no European knight could be expected to possess. Saladin's forces had designed this prison specifically to hold high value, European prisoners who possessed military knowledge that could be extracted through interrogation or used as bargaining chips in negotiations with Crusader leaders. The psychological impact of the location was deliberate. Prisoners could see the vast desert stretching to the horizon, a landscape so alien and hostile that escape seemed not just impossible but suicidal. The guards would deliberately point out the endless expanse of sand and rock, reminding prisoners that even if they somehow left the fortress, they would die of thirst within days. But William had been separated from his military unit during the battle, and he knew that if he didn't escape soon, he would either be executed as a high-value prisoner or spend the rest of his life in captivity. The psychological pressure of being completely cut off from his homeland, his fellow crusaders, and any hope of rescue was driving him to the edge of despair. He'd been a man of action his entire life, solving problems through engineering and tactical planning, but now he faced a situation where conventional thinking seemed utterly inadequate. The cell where William was confined was barely large enough for him to lie down, carved from solid rock with walls that wept moisture constantly, creating a perpetual dampness that seeped into his bones. The only light came from a tiny window near the ceiling that provided just enough illumination to remind him that a world existed beyond his stone coffin. The psychological torture was as brutal as the physical conditions. He could hear the sounds of normal life echoing up from the valley below, voices speaking in languages he couldn't understand, the calls of merchants and the laughter of children, all serving as constant reminders of the freedom he'd lost. Then William began having dreams that showed him the desert landscape from a bird's-eye perspective, as if he were soaring high above the cliffs and mountains like an eagle surveying the entire region. These aerial dreams revealed hidden wadis, dry riverbeds that could provide shelter and navigation routes, ancient water sources marked by subtle changes in vegetation that were invisible from ground level, and forgotten trade routes that crisscrossed the seemingly empty desert in patterns that had been used for centuries by nomadic peoples. What made these dreams absolutely extraordinary was their geological accuracy. William's sleeping mind was somehow providing him with detailed information about underground water sources, seasonal patterns that determined when temporary streams would flow through the wadis, and navigation techniques that relied on subtle landscape features rather than obvious landmarks. He learned to recognize rock formations that indicated underground springs, to identify plant patterns that revealed the presence of water even when no surface moisture was visible, and to read the landscape like a three-dimensional map that showed not just geography but the hidden infrastructure of desert survival. The dreams also revealed something that seemed impossible for a European crusader to know: the exact locations and seasonal movements of Bedouin tribes who traveled through the region. William's dreams showed him which tribal groups would be friendly to escaped prisoners, where they would camp during different seasons, and even specific cultural protocols for approaching them safely as a stranger seeking assistance. He saw the complex social and political relationships between different nomadic groups, understood which tribes were allied with Saladin's forces, and which ones maintained neutrality or even sympathy for Christian prisoners. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of William's prophetic dreams was their timing precision. His sleeping mind calculated optimal weather windows for desert travel, predicted sandstorm patterns weeks in advance, and even revealed the exact phases of moon and star positions that would provide optimal navigation conditions for his escape route. The level of meteorological knowledge was extraordinary for a medieval European knight who had no formal training in desert weather patterns. Yet his dreams provided information about seasonal wind patterns, temperature variations, and the precise timing of weather phenomena that would be crucial for survival during extended desert travel. William spent months preparing for his escape while pretending to be a broken, defeated prisoner. He secretly crafted tools from materials in his cell, sharpening metal fragments against stone surfaces to create cutting implements, weaving rope from fabric scraps using techniques his dreams had somehow taught him, and fashioning containers that could hold water and food for extended travel. He memorized the astronomical calculations from his dreams, practicing star recognition during the brief periods when he could see the night sky through his tiny window, and developing an internal compass based on celestial navigation techniques that his visions had revealed. He also studied his guards and the fortress routine with the systematic approach of an engineer conducting a survey. William realized that his best chance would come during a specific confluence of factors: a moonless night for maximum darkness, a shift change that would leave certain guard positions temporarily unmanned, and weather conditions that would provide cover for his movements while not being so severe that they would prevent travel. His dreams had shown him that this perfect window would occur during late spring, when seasonal weather patterns would create optimal conditions for the initial phase of his escape. The night of his escape, William rappelled down the cliff face using ropes he'd woven from fabric scraps, following a route his dreams had shown him that avoided guard positions and utilized natural handholds in the rock face. The descent was terrifying, hundreds of feet of sheer rock wall in complete darkness, with nothing but his memory of dream-provided navigation to guide him. One mistake would mean immediate death. But William moved with the confidence of someone following a path he'd traveled many times before, even though he'd never physically made this descent. Once he reached the desert floor, William began a journey that was guided entirely by the navigation knowledge his dreams had provided. He traveled by night using star patterns his visions had taught him to recognize, found water sources exactly where his dreams had indicated they would be, and encountered friendly Bedouin tribes at precisely the predicted locations. The physical demands of desert travel were extraordinary, walking for hours through sand and rock, enduring temperature extremes that ranged from freezing nights to blazing days, and maintaining his direction and pace despite exhaustion, hunger, and the constant threat of discovery by enemy patrols. The most amazing part of William's journey was its cultural accuracy. When he encountered Bedouin groups, he was able to use specific greeting rituals, gift-giving protocols, and cultural knowledge that his dreams had somehow provided. These interactions were so authentic that several tribal leaders assumed he had extensive prior experience with desert peoples, when in fact he had never left Europe before joining the crusade. His dreams had taught him not just the geography and survival techniques needed for desert travel, but also the complex social skills required to navigate between different cultural groups and gain their assistance. One particularly crucial encounter occurred when William was discovered by a Bedouin hunting party while resting in a wadi during daylight hours. According to his dreams, he should approach them with his hands open and visible, speak a specific Arabic phrase that indicated he was seeking protection as a traveler in distress, and offer them a small metal object from his belt as a gift of respect. The interaction played out exactly as his visions had predicted. The hunters provided him with food and water, gave him directions to the next safe resting place, and even shared information about enemy patrol routes he should avoid. Throughout his journey, William encountered evidence that his dreams were accessing information far beyond anything his conscious mind could have known. He found ancient carved markers along desert routes that indicated safe passages, discovered abandoned shelter sites that provided protection during sandstorms, and even located cached supplies that previous travelers had left behind. His sleeping mind seemed to have tapped into a vast network of desert survival knowledge that had been accumulated over centuries by nomadic peoples, who had learned to thrive in this harsh environment. The journey took William 6 weeks of travel across some of the most hostile terrain in the Middle East, but his navigation was so precise that he arrived exactly where his dreams had indicated he would reach safety, at a Christian outpost near the Mediterranean coast where Crusader forces were stationed. The guards who met him were astonished not just by his survival, but by his detailed knowledge of desert routes, tribal locations, and geographic features that weren't documented in any European maps or military intelligence reports. Sir William de Montfort made it safely back to Crusader territory, where he rejoined his military unit and eventually returned to England. His detailed account of his escape became one of the most famous survival stories of the Crusade period. But what made it legendary wasn't just his physical endurance, it was the mysterious source of knowledge that had guided him through seemingly impossible circumstances. William spent the rest of his life trying to understand how his dreams had provided him with information that seemed to transcend normal human capabilities, and his story became a touchstone for discussions about the relationship between consciousness, survival instincts, and sources of knowledge that exist beyond ordinary sensory experience. His experience also changed his approach to military strategy and engineering. William became an advocate for paying attention to intuitive insights and non-rational sources of information when making tactical decisions, arguing that conventional military training was insufficient for dealing with the complexities of warfare in foreign environments. He developed techniques for enhancing dream recall and intuitive decision-making that he taught to other military engineers and commanders, contributing to a more holistic approach to warfare that recognized the importance of psychological and spiritual factors alongside technical expertise. Here's a story from the Salem, which trials that's going to make you reconsider everything you think you know about that dark period in American history. In 1692, Rebecca Hartwell, a midwife and herbal healer from Salem Village, was imprisoned on charges of witchcraft along with several other women who had been accused of practicing supernatural healing and prophecy. Rebecca wasn't guilty of anything except possessing medical knowledge that threatened the authority of male doctors and clergy in the community. Rebecca had learned her healing arts from her grandmother, who had immigrated from England with extensive knowledge of herbal medicine, midwifery, and the traditional healing practices that had been suppressed but not eliminated by centuries of Christian persecution. Her medical knowledge was sophisticated and effective, based on generations of accumulated experience with plant-based remedies, surgical techniques, and understanding of human anatomy that exceeded most formally trained physicians of her time. The Hartwell family had been practicing traditional healing for generations, maintaining a careful balance between providing essential medical services to their community and avoiding the kind of attention that could lead to accusations of witchcraft. Rebecca's grandmother had taught her not just the technical aspects of herbal medicine and midwifery, but also the social and political skills needed to operate as a female healer in a society that was increasingly suspicious of women who possessed knowledge or abilities that challenged conventional authority structures. Rebecca's practice had flourished in Salem Village because her treatments were remarkably effective. She could treat everything from difficult births and women's ailments to infections, broken bones, and even psychological conditions that other healers couldn't address. Her success rate was so high that families would travel considerable distances to seek her help, and she had developed a reputation as someone who could save lives when conventional medicine failed. But this very success made her a target for suspicion and eventual persecution. The witch trial hysteria that swept through Salem in 1692 was driven by a complex combination of religious extremism, social tensions, economic conflicts, and psychological factors that created an atmosphere where accusations of supernatural wrongdoing could destroy lives and families. Women like Rebecca, who possessed knowledge or skills that seemed to exceed normal human capabilities, were particularly vulnerable to accusations, especially if their success threatened the authority or livelihood of established male professionals. Rebecca's arrest came after she successfully treated a series of difficult cases that had baffled other healers and physicians. When several prominent families credited her with saving their children's lives during a fever epidemic, some community members began whispering that her medical knowledge was too sophisticated to be natural, that she must be receiving supernatural assistance from demonic sources. The fact that she could diagnose illnesses and predict their course with remarkable accuracy was seen as evidence of otherworldly powers rather than exceptional skill and knowledge. The Salem witch trial imprisonment was designed to break the accused both physically and psychologically before their trials. Women were chained in dark, freezing cells, given minimal food and water, and subjected to constant psychological pressure to confess to crimes they hadn't committed. The survival rate was low, and everyone understood that imprisonment was often just a slow form of execution that allowed authorities to maintain legal appearances while eliminating perceived threats to religious and social order. The conditions in Salem's makeshift prison were deliberately brutal. Women were kept in underground cells that were barely large enough to lie down in, with no heat, inadequate clothing, and sanitation facilities that consisted of buckets that were emptied infrequently. The psychological torture was as severe as the physical hardships. Prisoners were constantly told that confession was their only hope of avoiding execution, while being reminded that confession would also result in the loss of their property, their families, and their place in the community. But Rebecca and 4 other imprisoned women, Martha Corey, Mary Warren, Elizabeth Proctor, and Abigail Faulkner, began experiencing what they called shared visions that showed them a coordinated escape plan involving all 5 prisoners simultaneously. These weren't just random fantasies born of desperation. They were detailed, practical visions that revealed specific information about the jail's construction, guard schedules, and potential escape routes that none of the women could have known through normal observation. The shared visions revealed that Salem's hastily constructed prison had several structural weaknesses that could be exploited by prisoners who understood the building's design flaws. The women saw that certain walls were thinner than others, that some floorboards could be loosened to access crawl spaces beneath the building, and that the guard schedule included periods when the jail was only lightly supervised. More importantly, their collective dreams showed them how to coordinate their activities to take advantage of these vulnerabilities without alerting their captors. What made these shared visions particularly remarkable was how they revealed information about a network of sympathetic colonists who were secretly working to help accused witches escape before their trials. The visions showed specific safe houses, trusted contacts, and even coded communication methods that would allow the escaped women to coordinate their movements without being recaptured. This underground network included people from various social classes and religious backgrounds who had become convinced that the witch trials were based on hysteria rather than genuine supernatural threats. The resistance network had been organized by colonists who had watched the accusations spread and recognized that the trials were targeting innocent people whose only crimes were possessing knowledge, skills, or independence that threatened established authority structures. These secret allies included merchants who provided funding, farmers who offered hiding places, clergy who questioned the theological basis for the trials, and even some government officials who had grown uncomfortable with the legal procedures being used to prosecute accused witches. Rebecca later wrote in her secret diary, hidden in a false bottom of her wooden food bowl, that the shared dreams felt like attending planning meetings in another dimension. Each prisoner would contribute different expertise to the collective vision. Rebecca's knowledge of human psychology and healing techniques, Martha's understanding of local geography and safe travel routes, Mary's familiarity with household and building construction, Elizabeth's connections to merchant networks, and Abigail's knowledge of legal procedures and court schedules. The dreams weren't just showing them escape routes, they were providing comprehensive tactical intelligence that drew upon each prisoner's individual expertise while synthesizing it into a collective plan that none of them could have developed alone. It was as if their 5 sleeping minds were functioning as a single strategic computer, processing information and generating solutions with capabilities that exceeded their individual conscious abilities. The visions also revealed something that seemed impossible, the exact timing of when public opinion would begin turning against the witch trials, creating a window of opportunity when escaped prisoners would be more likely to find community, support rather than immediate betrayal to authorities. The women saw that the trials would eventually collapse under the weight of their own contradictions, but that this change would take months to develop and would be triggered by accusations against increasingly prominent and respected community members. For 2 months, the women worked to implement the escape plan their collective unconscious had designed. Using the limited materials available in their cells, they created tools, prepared disguises, and established communication protocols that would allow them to coordinate their movements once they were outside the jail. The work required incredible patience and secrecy. Any discovery would mean immediate transfer to more secure facilities or acceleration of their trial dates. The preparation phase involved each woman acquiring specific materials and skills, while maintaining the appearance of defeated resignation. Rebecca used her medical knowledge to create herbal preparations that would help the women maintain their strength during the physical demands of escape and travel. Martha applied her understanding of local geography to memorize safe routes and identify reliable sources of food and shelter. Mary used her construction knowledge to identify the jail's structural weaknesses and develop techniques for exploiting them without creating obvious evidence of tampering. The most remarkable aspect of their shared dreaming was its adaptive quality. As conditions in the prison changed, new guards altered schedules, modified security procedures, their collective dreams would update the escape plan accordingly. It was as if their 5 sleeping minds were constantly monitoring current conditions and adjusting their strategy based on real-time information that their conscious minds couldn't access. When Rebecca noticed that one of the guards seemed sympathetic to the prisoner's plight, their dreams immediately began providing detailed information about his personal background, his motivations for working at the jail, and the optimal approaches for gaining his cooperation without putting him at risk. When prison routines changed due to increased public attention to the trials, their shared dreams recalculated timing sequences and alternative routes that would accommodate the new conditions. The night of their actual escape, everything unfolded exactly as they had envisioned. They broke out of their cells using techniques their visions had revealed, moved through the jail using routes their shared dreams had mapped out, and encountered assistance from sympathetic colonists who had been contacted through the coded message system their visions had provided. The coordination was so precise that all 5 women were able to escape simultaneously without alerting the guards, until several hours after they had already reached their first safe house. All 5 women successfully escaped Salem and made it to safe communities in other colonies where they lived under assumed names. Rebecca continued practicing midwifery and herbal medicine, carefully avoiding any activities that might attract the kind of attention that had led to her persecution. She maintained correspondence with the other escaped women for the rest of her life, and together they documented the mysterious phenomenon of shared visions that had saved their lives. What fascinates me about Rebecca's story is how it demonstrates that even during the darkest periods of history, human consciousness seems capable of accessing collective knowledge and coordination abilities that transcend individual limitations. The shared dreaming experience suggests that under extreme circumstances, separate minds can somehow connect and share information that enables survival and resistance against oppressive systems. The 5 women's experience also provides insight into the social and political dynamics that made the Salem witch trials possible, while demonstrating the existence of hidden networks of resistance that work to protect innocent people from persecution. Their story reminds us that even during periods when official institutions become instruments of oppression, there are always individuals and groups working to preserve human dignity and protect the vulnerable from injustice. And now for something that's going to take us to the age of exploration, where the difference between discovering new lands and disappearing forever into the vast Atlantic often came down to information that seemed impossible to possess. In 1487, a Portuguese navigator named João Vaz Cortreel was leading an expedition to find new fishing grounds off the coast of Newfoundland when his ship was caught in a massive storm that drove them far off course into uncharted waters. What happened next would become one of the most documented cases of prophetic dreaming in maritime history. João wasn't just any ordinary sea captain, he came from a family of renowned Portuguese navigators who had been exploring the Atlantic for generations. His father had been instrumental in developing the navigational techniques that allowed Portuguese ships to venture farther from shore than ever before, and João had spent his entire adult life perfecting the art of ocean navigation using stars, currents, and weather patterns. He understood the sea like other men understood the land, reading its moods and movements with an expertise that had kept him alive through dozens of dangerous voyages. But this particular expedition had gone wrong from the beginning. The weather had been unusually unpredictable, with storm systems appearing suddenly and driving them far from their intended course. Their instruments had been damaged in the first major storm, leaving them with only basic navigational tools and João's extensive experience to guide them. Worse, their food and water supplies were running dangerously low, and the crew was beginning to show signs of scurvy and malnutrition that would make them increasingly unable to handle the ship effectively. For 3 days after the worst storm, João had been unable to determine their position using conventional navigation methods. The sky had remained overcast, preventing him from taking star sightings, and the ocean currents in this region didn't match any patterns he recognized from his charts or previous experience. They were essentially lost in the middle of the Atlantic with no reliable way to find their bearings and no idea which direction would take them toward land and safety. On the 4th night after the storm, João had a dream unlike anything he'd ever experienced in his decades of seafaring. In this dream, he found himself floating high above the ocean, able to see the entire Atlantic as if it were a vast map spread out below him. But this wasn't just a bird's-eye view of the surface. He could see the hidden currents flowing beneath the waves, warm and cold streams of water moving in complex patterns that were invisible from ship level, but formed a vast network of underwater rivers that crisscrossed the ocean. The dream showed João that these underwater currents were like highways that could carry ships quickly and efficiently towards specific destinations, but only if navigators understood how to read the subtle surface signs that indicated where the currents flowed. and how to position their vessels to take advantage of these natural forces. He saw that experienced sailors could use changes in water color, temperature variations, the behavior of seabirds, and even the patterns of floating debris to identify current boundaries and navigate using this hidden infrastructure of ocean circulation. But what made Joe's dream truly extraordinary was its revelation of a specific current system that would carry his ship directly toward the coast of what would later be called Labrador. In his dream, he could see that they were currently positioned near the edge of a powerful northward flowing current that would take them to fishing grounds richer than anything the Portuguese had discovered before. More importantly, this current would also provide a reliable route back to familiar waters where they could resupply and repair their ship. The dream also revealed detailed information about the weather patterns in this region, showing Joe that the persistent overcast skies were actually a seasonal phenomenon that would clear within a few days, allowing him to resume normal navigation techniques. But during the cloudy period, he could use the current system and other environmental signs to maintain his course and position his ship optimally for when visibility returned. When Joel woke from this dream, he was so convinced of its accuracy that he immediately began implementing the navigation techniques his vision had revealed. He ordered his crew to adjust their course to intercept the current he had seen, using subtle changes in water color and the flight patterns of seabirds to guide their movements. His crew was initially skeptical about following navigation instructions based on a dream, but Joel's reputation as a skilled navigator and their desperate circumstances convinced them to trust his judgment. Within hours of changing course, the ship encountered the powerful northward current exactly where Joel's dream had predicted it would be. The water temperature increased noticeably. The color changed to the deep blue that indicated a major ocean current, and they began making much better speed toward the north. Most remarkably, the seabirds they encountered were species that Joel recognized as indicators of rich fishing grounds, confirming that they were headed toward the productive waters his dream had promised. 3 days later, exactly as his vision had predicted, the overcast skies cleared and Joel was able to take accurate star sightings that confirmed their position and course. They had been carried by the current to within sight of the Newfoundland coast, where they discovered fishing grounds so rich that a single day's work filled their nets with more cod than they had caught during weeks of fishing in European waters. But Joel's prophetic dream had revealed more than just navigation techniques and fishing locations. He had also seen specific details about the coastline they would encounter, including protected harbors where they could take shelter during storms, freshwater streams where they could replenish their supplies, and even the locations of indigenous settlements where they might be able to trade for provisions and repair materials. Over the following weeks, as Joel's expedition explored the newfound coast, every detail from his dream proved accurate. They found the protected harbors exactly where his vision had indicated, discovered freshwater sources at the predicted locations, and even encountered indigenous peoples who were willing to trade fish and other supplies in exchange for European metal goods and textiles. The most remarkable aspect of Joel's story was how his dream provided knowledge allowed him to establish what became one of the most successful fishing operations in the early history of European exploration in North America. The current system he had learned about in his vision provided reliable transportation to and from the fishing grounds. The coastal features he had seen allowed his ships to operate safely in unfamiliar waters, and the environmental knowledge his dream had revealed enabled his crews to work productively in conditions that would have been challenging for navigators who lacked this information. Joe returned to Portugal with detailed charts and navigation instructions based on his prophetic dream, establishing the foundation for Portuguese fishing expeditions that would continue for decades. His success attracted the attention of other navigators and cartographers, who studied his techniques and tried to understand how he had acquired such detailed knowledge of previously unknown ocean regions. The João Vaz Corte-Real expedition became legendary in Portuguese maritime circles, not just for its discovery of rich fishing grounds, but for its demonstration that navigation could sometimes depend on sources of information that transcended conventional seamanship. Joe's story inspired other navigators to pay attention to dreams and intuitive insights when making critical decisions during ocean voyages, contributing to a more holistic approach to navigation that recognized the importance of non-rational sources of knowledge alongside technical expertise. Joe continued exploring and mapping the North Atlantic for the rest of his career, but he never again experienced prophetic dreams as detailed and accurate as the one that had saved his expedition and led to the discovery of the Newfoundland fishing grounds. He often reflected on the mysterious source of the knowledge that had appeared in his dream, wondering whether it represented some form of divine guidance, an unconscious synthesis of his accumulated maritime experience, or access to information that existed beyond the normal boundaries of human consciousness. His detailed journals, preserved in Portuguese maritime archives, provide one of the most comprehensive first-hand accounts of how prophetic dreams can provide practical guidance for navigation and exploration, demonstrating that the relationship between consciousness and environmental knowledge might be more complex and mysterious than Suo understanding suggests. Joe's story remains a touchstone for discussions about the role of intuition and non-rational decision-making in maritime exploration, showing how the dreaming mind can sometimes access geographical and environmental information that conscious reasoning cannot provide. As we settle deeper into these stories, it's worth taking a moment to consider how different cultures throughout history have understood the relationship between dreams and practical problem solving. What we've been exploring tonight isn't just a collection of unusual historical anecdotes. It's actually part of a much larger pattern of human experience that spans virtually every civilization and time period. In ancient Egypt, dreams were considered direct communications from the gods, and dream interpretation was one of the most respected professions in society. Egyptian prisoners often spent their time in captivity engaged in ritual dream practices, believing that the gods would provide them with guidance for escape or redemption. The Edwin Smith Papyrus, dating to around 1600 BCE, contains detailed instructions for inducing prophetic dreams during times of crisis or imprisonment. What's fascinating is that these weren't just superstitious practices. They were sophisticated psychological techniques that we're only beginning to understand today. Ancient Egyptian dream incubation involved specific dietary restrictions, meditation practices, and environmental conditions that modern sleep researchers recognize as optimal for enhancing REM sleep and dream recall. The Egyptians had somehow figured out how to maximize their brain's problem-solving capabilities during sleep, centuries before we understood the neuroscience behind it. The practice of sleeping in temples specifically designed for dream induction was incredibly widespread. The Temple of Imhotep at Saqqara was essentially an ancient dream research facility where people would come from across the Mediterranean world to receive divine guidance through carefully orchestrated dreaming experiences. These temples were designed with specific acoustic properties, lighting conditions, and even aromatic environments that enhanced the likelihood of vivid, memorable dreams. Ancient Greek culture took dream problem-solving even more seriously. The practice of enkoimesis, sleeping in sacred temples to receive divine guidance through dreams, was so respected that it was used by military leaders, judges, and political officials facing difficult decisions. Greek prisoners would often be brought to dream temples before their trials, where they would engage in ritual sleeping designed to reveal solutions to their legal predicaments or to receive visions of escape routes. The Greeks understood something that we're just rediscovering in modern neuroscience, that the sleeping brain processes information differently than the waking brain, often making connections and solving problems that conscious reasoning can't address. Aristotle wrote extensively about what he called prophetic dreams, describing them as the mind's ability to perceive patterns and calculate probable futures through unconscious analysis of subtle environmental cues. Aristotle's analysis was remarkably sophisticated for its time. He theorized that during sleep, the mind becomes freed from the distractions and limitations of sensory input, allowing it to process accumulated information in ways that reveal hidden patterns and connections. His writing suggests that he understood dreams as a form of unconscious data analysis rather than supernatural revelation, which is surprisingly close to modern cognitive theories about dream function. Medieval Islamic culture produced some of the most sophisticated analyses of dream-based problem-solving ever recorded. Scholars like Al-Dinawari and Ibn Khaldun wrote detailed treatises on what they called istikhara, the practice of seeking divine guidance through dreams. When facing impossible decisions or circumstances, Islamic prisoners were encouraged to engage in specific prayer and meditation practices designed to induce dreams that would reveal escape strategies or legal defenses. What's remarkable about medieval Islamic dream theory is how closely it resembles modern cognitive science. These scholars understood that dreams could access memories, process complex information, and generate creative solutions through mechanisms that operated below the threshold of conscious awareness. They developed elaborate classification systems for different types of problem-solving dreams and created training methods for enhancing dream recall and interpretation. The Islamic tradition also recognized what we now call lucid dreaming, the ability to maintain conscious awareness during dreams and direct their content towards specific problems or questions. Medieval Islamic texts describe techniques for achieving lucid states that are remarkably similar to methods developed by modern dream researchers, suggesting that these practices had been refined through centuries of systematic experimentation. Native American cultures developed perhaps the most sophisticated understanding of dreams as practical guidance systems. Vision quests, ritualized periods of fasting, isolation, and meditation designed to induce prophetic dreams were considered essential training for warriors, leaders, and anyone facing major life challenges. Many documented prison escapes by Native American prisoners involve guidance received through vision quest practices adapted to imprisonment conditions. The vision quest tradition understood that extreme physical and psychological stress could unlock mental capabilities that weren't accessible under normal circumstances. Native American dream practices deliberately created conditions of sensory deprivation, nutritional stress, and social isolation that are now recognized by neuroscientists as optimal for inducing altered states of consciousness that enhance pattern recognition and creative problem solving. But it wasn't just indigenous cultures that recognized the practical value of prophetic dreams. Medieval European monasteries developed sophisticated practices for what they called divine revelation through sleep. Monks facing theological disputes, architectural challenges, or administrative problems would engage in ritual fasting and prayer, designed to induce dreams that would provide guidance for complex decisions. The monastic tradition produced detailed manuals for interpreting dreams and distinguishing between meaningful guidance and random mental activity. These texts reveal a surprisingly scientific approach to dream analysis, with systematic methods for testing the accuracy of dream-provided information and techniques for enhancing the likelihood of receiving practical guidance through sleep. Modern science has finally begun to catch up with these ancient understandings of dream function. Contemporary neuroscience research has revealed that REM sleep, the phase when most vivid dreams occur, is crucial for memory consolidation, pattern recognition, and creative problem solving. During REM sleep, the brain processes information from recent experiences, integrates it with long-term memories, and generates new connections that often manifest as creative insights or solutions to problems that couldn't be solved during waking hours. The default mode network, a recently discovered brain system that's most active during rest and introspection, appears to be responsible for the kind of pattern recognition and creative synthesis that characterizes prophetic dreams. This network processes vast amounts of information that the conscious mind isn't aware of, identifying subtle patterns and generating predictive models about probable future events. Dr. Robert Stickgold at Harvard Medical School has demonstrated that sleep-dependent learning allows the brain to extract general principles from specific experiences and apply them to novel situations. His research suggests that the dreaming brain might be capable of making accurate predictions about future events by analyzing subtle patterns and accumulated sensory data that the conscious mind hasn't recognized. Recent studies of intuitive decision-making have shown that the unconscious mind can process complex information and generate accurate judgments faster and more reliably than conscious analysis. This research provides a scientific framework for understanding how the dreaming mind might access information and generate solutions that exceed the capabilities of waking reasoning. The phenomenon of thin boundary personalities, individuals who show enhanced permeability between conscious and unconscious mental processes, appears to be associated with increased accuracy in intuitive judgments and predictive insights. People with thin boundaries often report more vivid dreams, enhanced empathy, and greater sensitivity to environmental cues that others miss. But perhaps the most intriguing aspect of modern dream research involves the discovery of shared physiological responses to future events. Studies have shown that some individuals exhibit measurable physiological changes, increased heart rate, skin conductance, and brain activity several seconds before being shown emotionally significant images or information. This suggests that the nervous system might be capable of responding to future events through mechanisms that current science doesn't fully understand. The pattern recognition theory provides a rational framework for understanding many prophetic dreams, but it also raises profound questions about the capabilities of human consciousness. If our brains can unconsciously process vast amounts of information and make accurate predictions about future events, then consciousness might be far more powerful and sophisticated than we currently realize. Maybe the truth is some combination of pattern recognition and genuine precognition. Maybe our brains are constantly analyzing patterns and making predictions about probable futures, but maybe consciousness also occasionally accesses information through mechanisms we don't understand yet. Maybe some prophetic dreams result from sophisticated unconscious analysis, while others involve genuine glimpses of future events that exist outside the normal flow of causality. The scientific study of prophetic dreams is still in its early stages, and it's possible that future discoveries will revolutionize our understanding of human consciousness and its relationship to time. What's clear is that the phenomenon of prophetic dreaming represents something far more complex and interesting than simple coincidence or wishful thinking. It's a window into capabilities of the human mind that we're only beginning to explore. Before we drift off into whatever dreams await us tonight, let me share a few lesser-known stories about prophetic dreams that most people have never heard. Stories that are somehow even stranger than the famous cases everyone knows about. In 1923, a Swiss clockmaker named Klaus Weber started having the same dream every night for 6 months. In the dream, he was standing in his workshop when all of his clocks suddenly stopped working at exactly 3:17 a.m. Then he would hear a voice saying, "Time has run out for the clockmaker." Now, Klaus wasn't just any ordinary craftsman. He was considered one of the finest clockmakers in all of Switzerland. A man whose timepieces were so precise and beautiful that wealthy collectors from across Europe would travel to his small workshop in the Alps just to commission a single clock. Weber's workshop was filled with dozens of clocks of every size and style, grandfather clocks with intricate wooden cases, delicate mantel clocks with gold filigree, pocket watches with movements so complex they seemed like mechanical poetry. The Weber family had been making clocks for over 2 centuries, and Klaus took immense pride in continuing this tradition. He was known throughout the region for his meticulous attention to detail and his almost supernatural ability to diagnose problems with timepieces that other craftsmen couldn't repair. But this dream was unlike anything Klaus had ever experienced. Every night, without fail, he would find himself in his familiar workshop, surrounded by the gentle ticking and chiming of his beloved clocks. Then, always at exactly 3:17 a.m. according to every timepiece in the workshop, something impossible would happen. Every single clock would suddenly stop working simultaneously. The gentle symphony of ticking that had provided the soundtrack to Klaus's entire life would cease instantly, leaving behind a silence so complete it felt like death itself. The psychological impact of these dreams began affecting Klaus's waking life. He became obsessed with the time 3:17, checking his clocks constantly as that moment approached each morning and afternoon. He would find himself holding his breath as 3:17 arrived, half expecting all his real clocks to stop working just as they did in his dreams. The dreams felt more real than reality. He could smell the wood polish in his workshop, feel the texture of clock gears between his fingers, hear the specific tone and timbre of each timepiece's voice. Klaus began making preparations that seemed rational to him but appeared strange to his family and friends. He wrote detailed letters to his wife and children, organized his financial affairs with unusual thoroughness, and most remarkably, he began carving his own headstone. Using the same precision he brought to clockmaking, Klaus carved an elaborate stone monument that included not just his birth date, but also the exact date and time of his death, March 17, 1924, at 3:17 a.m. On March 17, 1924, exactly 6 months after the dreams had started, Klaus Weber died of a heart attack in his workshop. His apprentice found his body the next morning, slumped over his workbench with a half-finished clock movement in his hands. And every single clock in his workshop had stopped working at exactly 3:17 a.m. The local newspaper called it the most precisely predicted death in Swiss history. Speaking of time and prediction, there's another story about a London insurance clerk named Edward Morrison who, in 1901, began having dreams about specific maritime disasters weeks before they occurred. Edward worked for Lloyd's of London, processing shipping insurance claims, so he was intimately familiar with the statistical patterns of maritime accidents. But his dreams went far beyond statistical analysis. They showed him specific ships sinking at exact locations with precise details about weather conditions, mechanical failures, and even the names of crew members who would survive. Edward's first prophetic dream involved a cargo ship called the SS Marianne, which he saw running aground on a rocky outcrop near the Orkney Islands during a severe winter storm. The dream was so detailed that Edward could see the ship's registration numbers, count the exact number of lifeboats, and even observe specific conversations between crew members as they prepared to abandon ship. When the SS Marianne was indeed lost exactly as Edward had dreamed, he initially attributed it to coincidence. But then the dreams continued. Edward began seeing disasters involving ships he'd never heard of, traveling routes he'd never studied, encountering weather patterns that hadn't been predicted by any meteorological service. His dreams showed him not just when and where ships would be lost, but also the specific sequence of mechanical failures, human errors, and environmental conditions that would combine to create each disaster. The insurance company initially dismissed Edward's reports as the overactive imagination of a clerk who spent too much time studying maritime accident statistics. But when his predictions proved accurate time after time, Lloyd's began quietly using Edward's dream information to adjust insurance premiums and risk assessments. Ships that Edward had seen in his disaster dreams would suddenly find their insurance rates increased or their coverage canceled entirely, often just weeks before the predicted accidents occurred. Edward's prophetic dreams became so accurate that Lloyd's established a secret protocol for handling his reports. They would never officially acknowledge his predictions, but they would use the information to protect their financial interests while maintaining plausible deniability about the source of their insights. Edward essentially became Lloyd's unofficial prophet, a man whose sleeping mind could predict maritime disasters with accuracy that exceeded any statistical model or meteorological forecast. The ethical implications of Edward's situation were profound. Should he warn ship captains about disasters he'd seen in dreams, potentially saving lives but risking his reputation and employment? Should he remain silent and allow insurance companies to profit from his prophetic knowledge while people died in accidents he'd foreseen? Edward struggled with these questions for years, eventually suffering a nervous breakdown from the psychological pressure of knowing about disasters he felt powerless to prevent. In 1909, Edward had his most detailed and disturbing prophetic dream yet. He saw the largest ship ever built sinking in the North Atlantic after hitting an iceberg. The dream was so vivid that Edward could read the ship's name on its bow, Titanic. He saw hundreds of people dying in freezing water while lifeboats rode away half-empty, and he watched specific passengers, including several wealthy Americans whose names he'd never heard, struggling to survive in the chaos. When Edward reported this dream to Lloyd's, they quietly began adjusting their insurance policies for large passenger ships, particularly those planning to operate in North Atlantic routes during ice season. Then there's the story of Maria Santos, a Portuguese fisherman's daughter who, in 1755, began having dreams about a massive earthquake that would destroy Lisbon on All Saints' Day. Maria was an illiterate teenager who worked mending fishing nets and had never traveled beyond her small coastal village. Yet her dreams provided detailed information about Lisbon's architecture, population, and the specific geological conditions that would make the earthquake so devastating. Maria's dreams showed her the earthquake striking during morning mass on November 1st, when churches throughout Lisbon would be packed with worshippers. She saw specific buildings collapsing in precise sequences, witnessed the tsunami that would follow the earthquake, and even observed the fires that would rage through the city for days afterward. The level of geological and urban planning knowledge in her dreams exceeded anything available to an uneducated village girl in 18th century Portugal. When Maria tried to warn people about her visions, most villagers dismissed her as a superstitious child prone to nightmares. But a few people took her seriously enough to leave Lisbon before All Saints' Day, and their lives were saved when the Great Lisbon earthquake struck exactly as Maria had dreamed. The disaster killed an estimated 60,000 people and destroyed most of the city, but the handful of people who had listened to a fisherman's daughter survived because they had heeded the warning of her impossible dreams. These stories share a common thread: ordinary people receiving extraordinarily detailed information about future disasters through dreams, information that seems to transcend the boundaries of normal human knowledge. Whether it's a clockmaker predicting his own death to the minute, an insurance clerk foreseeing maritime disasters, or a village girl envisioning urban earthquakes, these cases suggest that human consciousness might occasionally access information about future events through mechanisms that our current understanding of reality cannot explain. Sometimes I wonder if the most private experience we have, our dreams, might actually connect us to something larger than individual consciousness. Maybe when we sleep, our minds occasionally tune into frequencies of information that exist beyond personal experience, beyond normal sensory perception, beyond the limitations of space and time that seem to constrain our waking lives. There's something both beautiful and terrifying about that possibility, the idea that our sleeping minds might sometimes know things our waking minds cannot. That the future occasionally broadcasts its intentions backward through time, appearing in the dreams of individuals who are somehow sensitive to these temporal echoes. It suggests that consciousness itself might be far more mysterious and powerful than we currently assume, capable of transcending the boundaries we think define human experience. If you're somehow still awake, which honestly would surprise me at this point. I hope tonight's journey through history's most impossible prison escapes has given you something fascinating to think about as you drift off. We've explored stories that challenge everything we think we know about the boundaries of human consciousness, the nature of time, and the untapped potential of the dreaming mind. These weren't just tales of physical escape. They were stories about mental liberation, about consciousness transcending the limitations that seem to define ordinary human experience. Whether it was Francois receiving architectural blueprints in his dreams, the monks sharing identical visions, or Tatanka Nugent navigating by spiritual GPS, each story suggests that our minds might be capable of things we've barely begun to understand. I'd love to hear your thoughts about tonight's stories. Drop a comment below and let me know where you're listening from and whether you've ever experienced dreams that felt more like memories of things that hadn't happened yet. Have you ever woken up from a dream with knowledge you couldn't possibly have acquired through normal means? And if these strange historical tales have sparked your curiosity about the mysteries of human consciousness, you might enjoy next week's exploration into the most accurate prophetic dreams in recorded history. We'll be diving into cases where people dreamed about future events with such precision that they seem to challenge our basic understanding of how time works. Until then, sleep well, and who knows? Maybe tonight you'll dream about something that hasn't happened yet, but somehow will. The boundary between sleeping and waking, between past and future, between individual minds and collective consciousness might be far more porous than we typically assume. Sweet dreams, fellow travelers through the strange landscape of human experience. See you in your dreams.